Trevor.
Hi.
Welcome. People will be signing in now. It's 8 o'clock. And this is week 2 in our 8-week step workshop at Avenues. Tonight we are on step 3. Before we get into this, we'll do a quick review. What we covered last week was steps 1 and 2. Steps 1, we looked at what are we admitting to? And we're admitting to the simple fact that we have substance use disorder. And we're starting to get an idea of what this is. And that the problem that we want to start to focus on in steps 1 and 2 is this prior condition to use. And we saw that could happen in many different ways through maybe an issue with attunement, detachment, trauma. But at some point in our lives, an addiction showed up to protect us from something that might have already been there. And they're saying when it comes to our addiction, when we looked at Alcoholics Anonymous or NA or other communities, there's a condition that makes us subtly insane when it comes to use or committing to quitting by ourselves. And out of this desperation, we're making this admittance. We're deciding to join one of the recovery communities. And then we're going to move to step 3 tonight. Before we get started, I always want everyone to know, as they're signing on here, if anyone's in need for immediate help, please inbox Facebook or Avenues directly, and we will respond to it tonight. I also wanted to thank people. There seems to be an increase in using the hammock readings every morning. That's a way to start your day with intention, a meditative thought, a prayer, a poem, and it keeps us grounded in this kind of 4th dimensional feel of how we can loosely go through that day, knowing that everything's going to be all right. Tonight we're talking about step 3, and step 3 is made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. And that's the original writing from Alcoholics Anonymous in 1935. And we're looking at that. What does that mean? We just admitted that we have a serious disorder that's progressive and fatal. And if I can't solve this by myself, I'm accepting the idea that I can have help, maybe the same exact help of the person that I'm trusting now in one of these communities, because hopefully you're not doing this by yourself. That would be under the context of that. And you're going to turn your will in your life. What does that mean? Am I going to be a monk, crack out the sackcloth and a veil of tears as I march a trail of prayers? Not necessarily. We're admitting to the fact that our will is compromised. What is the will if it's under the distress of an addiction, especially one that has you using heroin or alcohol daily, where your conscious mind has been compromised and you can only, function or tolerate an existence with the use of a drug? I understand that. So it's hard when I sober up for 30 days or 6 months, this idea that I would compromise or surrender my will to what? A hive, a cult. I want to resist it. But if you see in AA, they have this common definition of alcoholism they really want to focus on, and we could just call it addiction, is something really peculiar happens to us when we're sober, that sobriety in itself is not enough, that we might be the obsession to use or the safety or this illusion that we can use successfully might return if we don't have a personality change so sufficient that we would overcome this addiction. And that's what the practice of the 12 steps is getting at. So step 3 is going to acknowledge this, and it's the last time in, essentially a little in NA and AA, or even if you were in another recovery community, to acknowledge addiction as use. And they're going to make it 4 parts that we can understand it a little uniquely. They're going to call it 4 character defects. And step 3 lets us confront the first one, and they start to describe an idea of selfishness, of motives, an operator that exists in the back of our head that is watching the whole show. Like when you're faking being something, what are you faking it from? From what point am I a fraud? Well, is that me underneath all of that? And we start to get curious about this idea. Where is self? What is the idea of self? Well, my version that I'm living off of is so distorted and unmeasured, with the idea of an ego, the consideration that I could solve my own problems, my inability to respond to impulse emotionally or with drugs. It's killing me. It's killing me. So we could take this step with the acknowledgement of another person through the form of a prayer sometimes, or an oath if you're secular. You know, wherever your belief system is at that point, it's not asking it to change in any 12-step community. Don't be that. I think that's the wrong consideration. From that point, wherever you're at, you could get well and you could continue the steps. So procedurally, the step is an oath. You are taking an oath that you will complete the steps with another person. And that's how it unpacks itself. Historically, it could be the prayer. Some people, I've heard guys say, you know, traditionally will get on their knees and pray, a prayer to God. I was pretty secular when I was taking this step, and my sponsor was sensitive to that. I was giving up the idea that I had a plan that was going to work. I was going to follow the plan my sponsor was laying out, and it was the same plan AA had. And my friends in NA describe that way. My friends in Dharma recovery describe a guide taking them through the idea that they're about to now confront an inventory of their grosser kind of handicaps. And this is where I want to focus on addiction and where my shame comes from. And this real addiction I had prior to use, fantasy, this place I retreat to in my head where it's all right. I'm not living my life in real time. So I want to start to begin this idea that I could wake up. And we have a great guest tonight that just is part of the Avenues family. And he's taking out a lot of his time tonight to share his experience and tell us a little bit about who he is and how he has practiced and continues to practice step 3. Let's hear it for Trevor.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much, Joe. And thank you, Avenues, for doing this. I think it's amazing, you know, just kind of reaching out and just another way of hearing a message. So first and foremost, I just want to put out there that if your experience doesn't relate to mine, totally okay. I might use words like God and higher power and even the word prayer, and those, you know, really might mean different things to you. So, you know, don't feel that my experience necessarily has to be yours or vice versa, of course. But yeah, I'm in recovery, and I wasn't always, of course. And so I'll give you a little bit of a quick background as to how I got to in a position to eventually be willing, where this step was kind of, you know, it was like a life-saving choice. I grew up in a really awesome environment. My mom's been sober most of my life, you know, so I grew up in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. I was like the kid running around and during anniversaries and stuff, trying to eat the cake, you know, before it was served, causing a ruckus. And Alcoholics Anonymous was a wonderful fellowship of people when I was really little and young. You know, people, they smoke cigarettes outside and cigars, and they curse and they drank coffee, but there was like a livelihood. There was an energy that I could just see from a young age. But interestingly enough, what happened is and it wasn't my first drink. I'd been drinking here and there from Christmas parties. You know, alcohol always, there was like an allure to it for whatever reason. But like my first real drunk, I could say that I remember at least, you know, wasn't anything amazing. It was Mike's Hard Lemonade with a good friend, Chris Smith. And I'll never forget, man, we were at a party and it was like 15 or so, 14, somewhere around there. And I had a couple Mike's Hard Lemonade, and all of a sudden I got to this place where everything was okay. And some interesting things happened in that moment. I knew that I could not be an alcoholic because my perception of alcoholics were people who didn't drink. Because again, I got brought up in recovery. So the only people I knew as alcoholics were people who were sober. And so in this mind of mine that just started to get diluted from alcohol, I had a core belief that I could never be an alcoholic, and the way that I proved that, was that I ended up on a journey of ingesting large amounts of alcohol and drugs, to somewhat prove that I would never be an alcoholic. It sounds absurd. A lot of things I did in my life are pretty absurd. So, um, addiction is certainly progressive, and the best thing about knowing that is so is recovery. But I had to get to a place where I had to let go of some old ideas, and through trial and error, and I found myself kicked out of college, and fights and hospitals, and small arrests, and as Joe was mentioning, that obsession of the mind, where I was always seeking something that knew that I felt better or thought better when I had something in my system. And I had no recognition that I was headed down this path where my decision making and my feelings and my thoughts were all kind of geared towards this. You need to check out. And so I I I really I went down, I went down the path that I think a lot of us, do. I drank and drugged almost every day. I drank and drugged my way out of my parents' home at the age of 20. And, from about 20 to 25, um, I really, my addiction just really took off. And it took me places that I would have always said I would have never, been: jail, hospitals, homelessness, doing things that were, chipping away at my self esteem and my self worth. And Joe, you mentioned that word shame, and that was such a integral part of my addiction. Um, it ran on shame, and you know I mentioned that I when I wake up, when I used to wake up in addiction, I would have this film reel of every single thing I ever thought I did bad or that I did do bad, like first 15, 20 seconds of my conscious moment. And the weight of that, pushed me to just needing some other solution. And I found my solution through drugs and alcohol. And of course, it was killing me. And I got to a place where I was going to be homeless again, in January. And I had like this, my dad had a talk with me that he's had a million times. He had, tears in his eyes. And my dad's a man's man, and he got sober through jail and all that stuff. But he's my stepdad. But he's the only dad I've known. And he said, "Trev, you're killing yourself." And for some reason, I had this moment of clarity where I felt his words, and I also believed it too. And I said those amazing words that I think all parents or loved ones want to hear from somebody, which is, I'll accept help. And I say it was like the SWAT team came out of nowhere once I said that. I was on a phone call with someone, and within a couple of days, I was in a long-term treatment program. And I went into that program, though, just letting you know, with the belief that I was going to drink wine and do cocaine on the weekends like a civilized person. So I don't want to give any indication that I walked in with this very willing spirit. That was a very small moment where I was able to say the word yes and follow through with some action. But I went through this treatment program, and in this experience, it talks about in the big book, needing to let go of some old ideas. First of all, I was confronted with the truth of my life in a way that was almost unbearable to the point where I did have thoughts of suicide. And it was very overwhelming for the first time since I had been about 14, to not have a substance in my body, to not have that armor to protect me. It was crushing. And I found myself so desperate, so willing for change, that I said a prayer, and I prayed before foxhole prayers, and my understanding of God, that while I was going through this, that if there was a God, I was definitely going to hell. So like that was a legitimate belief of mine. So I was caught between a rock and a hard place. I was, well, if there is a God, I'm definitely going to hell. But I hit this place of willingness, and I said a prayer, and uh, I wasn't struck sober in any measure, but I got some of the benefits that they talk about in the third step, about sensing this new power, sensing this new sense of direction, and it started my process. And so, I'm a very happy, grateful member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I've also gone to NA a bunch of times. I'm a fan of whatever journey gets you to the same destination. And I got a sponsor. I got a home group the second I got out of rehab, because I had taken on some very simple but new life-changing ideas. And one of those ideas, as Joe was mentioning, is that I came to conclude that no matter what I did, and no matter what kind of experience I had in that short amount of time, is that leaving rehab, I might eventually drink, despite me recognizing that I was destroying my life and all this stuff. And that terrified me. That terrified me to say, like, I'm not in control, right? Like, my brain's hijacked. I have this real obsession. I have no defense against the first drink, as Alcoholics Anonymous has taught me, and I subscribe to that idea, because there had been so many times in my life where I had been honest and sincere that I was not going to touch alcohol, heroin, crack ever again. You could have hooked me up to a lie detector, and I would have sworn to you that I was never going to do that again. And within a matter of hours, I was back in it. So I got a sponsor, I got a home group, and first two steps were something that, for me, on a surface level, were done kind of in my mind. The second step being really important for me to go to meetings. But this third step, making a decision to turn our will and our life over to the care of God as we understood him. My sponsor made it really easy in the beginning for me, which was, I came from a pretty structured AA group where, the steps were not negotiable. Everybody kind of went through it at the same pace. So it was like, if I had people in front of me, I knew that they were a couple steps in front of me. If I had somebody behind me with a little bit less time, I knew that, so it was a very community experience, but it was directed. And I'll never forget, my sponsor, in the simplest form, said, "Hey, do you want to go on with the program?" Like, he made it that simple. This idea of turning my will and my life over to a God of my not understanding at that time, to a degree, was, well, you do a third step by doing a fourth. And that allowed me to make substantial progress outside of the concepts that I couldn't really quite understand about this idea of will and life and God and turning it over. And so, what I've come to appreciate about the third step, or my experiences, is that in order to do, for me, that every time I practice this program, it is an example of me practicing my third step. And Joe mentioned the word selfishness, and the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and how it works. The fact that it was written so many years ago, and that you could read it, and it applied to my life. It talks about selfishness, self-centeredness, that being the root of our troubles, and I understood that. Through treatment, and then through being in the meetings, and opening up my mind and reading literature, I understood that I was, I always almost thought I was a people pleaser. And my mom heard in a great meeting down in Florida, she's like, a people pleaser is just a me pleaser. Because at the end of the day, I was trying to wrest satisfaction out of trying to please other people, or if only they would do what I wanted them to do. And so I was always at some sort of unease, either with others or with myself. And, you start to read in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and just being in meetings, you hear people talk about fear and self-centered fear. And these were things that I had never really heard before, that idea of self-centered fear. And it just opened up my understanding of what my self was. And by the time, so I entered treatment at the age of 25, and I looked at my life, which was failed school, hospitals, jails, uh, doing things that were certainly outside of any normal living, completely shame-based life experience. My motto was, people would always say, "Oh, like Trev, you're such a good guy," because I would put on a really good face, and I would say in my head, I would be like, "Well, if you only knew the real me," and um, and so I got to this place, and I really desperately wanted help. I can't, like, that was a gift of mine. I say, for me, that's step one of accepting my powerlessness. The way that I view it was that was a gift provided to me, because I really went from, like, I snuck drugs into, like, I didn't know that I snuck drugs into the rehab, but then I found it. So, like, again, that was my mind, right? Drinking wine and doing cocaine on the weekends, to then, like, being all in, being like, I can't have any success in life with alcohol or drugs in my life, and that I don't know how to stay away from a drink or a drug on my own power. And there was such a freeing experience, but it was frightening, because I was admitting to myself that I had conceded to my innermost self, right, that I was truly powerless. And that opened up the doors. It wasn't like I was defeated. It was like I had been exposed to Alcoholics Anonymous now, and I was around people who were telling me that they had found a power greater than themselves that allowed them to live in peace with the world, and to ultimately not drink or drug, which was the biggest thing that I wanted out of life. And um, as Joe mentioned, there's that third step prayer, and my sponsor gave me the third and seventh step prayer card. And again, this is very much what the whole group was doing. He was like, "Listen, just read this card. I don't care if you believe in God or not. Just read this card on your knees every morning, and just try to do it." And I had, truthfully, I had kind of a an initial spiritual awakening, let's say, in one of those experiences while I was in treatment. So I was all about this non-understanding of God, but knowing that there's something out there that was truly loving, creative, created. Like, I had absorbed this idea that the universe was not against me, but for me, and not just for me, by the way, but for everyone, my enemies, my strangers, people I didn't know, people that hurt me. That there was this real love out there. So anyway, he gave me this third seventh step prayer card, and it reads, "God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always." And some of those words, some of the meanings, really, like, they've transformed. Like, so this idea of a third step, right, initially was, okay, I do a fourth, but that wasn't it, right? It was, I have a will and a life, which, again, I've picked up. Everything you're going to hear is not original for me. So will and life was described as to my thoughts and actions, right? I'm here to turn over my thoughts and actions to my AA group, to my sponsor, to Alcoholics Anonymous, and to whatever understanding I have of God. And that didn't mean that, I didn't have to beat myself up about thoughts that I had. I didn't have to beat myself up about the difficulties that I had trying to do well in life. It was just, my life was now not going to necessarily be in my control. And interestingly enough, I had 6 months of sobriety, right? Because I had 3 months in treatment, 3.5 months in treatment. I was 90 days into the program, and it's a little um, embarrassing to admit, but I was back in my parents' house at age 25, and I had an issue walking the dog or taking out the recyclables, right? Like, a real sense of selfishness was still very much with me. And for the first time, I recognized it as a problem within myself. Wasn't my parents, wasn't the world around me. And that's what, I mean, the Big Book of Anonymous, it's amazing, the literature, because it mentions about how our troubles were usually of our own making. And when I start to look back on my life, I see that the problems that I created in my own head and in relationships were of my own making. I either put myself in a position to be hurt by others. I either put myself in a position to be too dependent on others because I was driven by fear. I was just, I just had no sense of, the only sense I had again was that I wasn't good enough. This idea of who I am as a person was eradicated and influenced by my use of drugs and alcohol. So I get to this step with 6 months of not using a drink or a drug in my system, 3 months out of being out of treatment, being around Alcoholics Anonymous every single day. I was afforded every opportunity to get sober. I went to a 6:30 morning meeting. I went to a 12:15 meeting, and I went to my home groups meetings, which were either 1 to 2 meetings a night. And so I was absorbed around this AA community, and I wanted to change. Even without doing the 4-step, I knew I believed that selfishness would create so much disharmony in my life, with relationships, with anything I wanted, that I would eventually feel or believe that I needed a drink. And if I felt that way and I had no defense against a trivial thought that said, "Well, Trev, you've had 6 months now. You could go have a beer. You could go smoke a little weed." Like, I knew that selfishness, that self-centeredness, which would create so much dysfunction and harm in my life, I had to find a way to get rid of it. And Alcoholics Anonymous told me that the only way to do that, truthfully, was not on my power alone. It it needed my participation for sure, but I also needed to seek outside. And so this concept of God and of higher power, um, it's grown, it's been simplified, it changes with me, but ultimately this idea saying, this prayer talks about, God, I offer myself to thee to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. And that tells me that I I'm expected to build something and to do some things. So there's like a lot of action there. And then this piece about relieve me of the bondage of self. Man, I just celebrated 11 years January 13th, and that bondage of self can still be a problem for me if I'm not careful with my program. This idea of what do I think I need, and what kind of happiness am I trying to extract out of situations. It could still put me in that position where I'm in disharmony with the world around me, and I'm in disharmony with myself. And so this third step, this prayer, um, it it tells me like, hey, I made a mess of my life, like really, really bad. So what do I have to lose by trusting in something that I can visibly see is helping hundreds and thousands of people? And of course, I have to go on with the program, and I have to do a fourth. And so what happens is that this program, the steps for me are, I never want to do them, by the way, like instinctively. All the steps. When push comes to shove, there's a resistance from my ego, from my selfishness, from this vast amount of fear that tells me I'll either be alone, or that I won't be good enough, or that people won't like me. That I I need something from the right. I need relief from that, and I start to find this relief. So here's my experience. The third step, it's with me every day. The I would say the point of practicing it is contingent on my ability to align my actions with the principles of the program. Um, and and so that's, that was really simple for me at a certain point in time. It's like, oh, I have to be honest, I have to be caring, I have to be considerate, I have to be forgiving, I have to be all right. So there's all these things. It didn't have to be about, well, what do I believe about God or not? And in that moment, and that bondage of self, I just it it's what would take me back out, by the way. 11 years in, I've known people with long periods of sobriety that go back out, and truthfully, it always sounds to be the same, that they made a decision based off self, which removed them from the solution that was working for them. And I've seen that in my own life, not to the point where I've taken a drink, but I've gotten off the path. And the way back on the path always for me tends to be looking at my third step. You hear things in the rooms like, if you feel you've moved away from God, who's really moved, right? Like kind of like those gems. Um, and I know we're coming up on time. So the last thing I want to say about the third step is that this step grows, but in simplicity, in being simple, it means that I've made a commitment, like Joe was mentioning, an oath, a decision, and it's like, Joe and I talked about this before, because it's a Joe and Charlie big book study. Like, when I made a decision to go to college, right, I first looked at 16 different colleges. I then had to do financial aid. I then had to pack. I then had to do X, Y, and Z. Then I had to get in the car, right? I had to do all of these things to actually follow through with this decision. And so in order to really practice a true third step for me in my life is that I have to go on with the program, and I have to make that decision every day. Sometimes I wake up, I don't want to pray, and I'll remember, like, oh shoot, like I got to pray. That idea of I having to pray is not fear-based. It's, oh, I made a decision 10 years ago, 11 years ago, to turn my will and my life over to the care of God. And it's amazing what happens with does that. I live an amazing life, I have to say. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not here to, talk about how great I am. I've been given so many gifts, and they were all made possible by this decision to trust the program, trust people, trust the God of my misunderstanding, which eventually became a God of my understanding. So I can definitely ramble, but I really appreciate this opportunity. I really look forward to hearing, from you guys. And thanks again, Joe Avenues, for having me share a little bit about my experience with the third step.
Trevor, thank you very much. I didn't realize you grew up around AA. I have a very similar story. There wasn't a word I couldn't relate to. And I just think that's the overwhelming power of fellowship. Prior to finishing the steps, you're connected. And by this time, you're taking the step 3, you're connecting with people. And I can relate to every word you were saying. The identity of shame. Russ getting on a flight. But that was great. The practice of the step and the preparation, and not to get tripped up on God. I love that you said a God of my misunderstanding. Of course, this is where I'm standing, but this is enough. I can make a decision here. And what's the decision? I'm gonna start writing an inventory. I'm going to get ready to do this. A sponsor, a friend, a therapist, if you have a priest, it doesn't matter. Can I keep moving it forward? I've already trusted another recovered addict or alcoholic. We're going to go into the section and we'll start fielding questions. If we want to field questions on anything, if any of you need immediate help, please reach out to us directly, and list that you're here so we can know you're here. And did anyone do their homework from last week? Did anyone find the second step prayer? If that goes into the comments section, you're going to have the most fashionable recovery hoodie that this side of the Mississippi. So we'll wait for that. Trevor, the other thing I was thinking of, like Rat Park, right? Rat Park, it's a study. It's from the late 70s. I think it was 78 to like the early 80s. The psychologist, he was Canadian. I think his name, Brandon Alexander. It popped in my head. So this study takes rats that are addicted to morphine, and they started to reach to other drugs. And the point of the study is this premise: do drugs and alcohol cause addiction? No, they do not. And that's kind of what we're invisibly coming to terms with at step 3. We might not be able to articulate it. I wasn't able to at that point. I was just surrendering out of desperation. I wanted to join what other guys had, and they were being really kind to me and wanted to help me. But that's how powerful community is. Like if it's AA, Dharma, that when they would remove these rats that were addicted to morphine or cocaine and put them with the group, that was not addicted, they recovered. And it said that it's the power of joining a community trumps the addiction. And now we're not rats, but that goes to say, like, how powerful that is for a mammal. We take it even a step further, that we're going to go all the way to this personality change. It's my mind. It was the condition of my mind where an addiction can flourish. Now, addictions are progressive, fatal. Tolerance goes up. We know that to be distinct. But that's where I want the help to. That's when I'm confronted in step 3. And you said that so beautifully. It'd be hard not to relate to you if you had any addiction. You just nailed it.
Thanks,
I think
John.
we have some questions coming in, Chris. And yes, he found the second step prayer. All right. Anybody else? It's close. We read it at How It Works at most meetings. We ask for his care and protection with complete abandon. That's the first time they're asking us to say a prayer before step 3. Thank you. Oh, Megan's getting a hoodie. It's fine. It's great, Chris. Chris, good to see you. Trevor, how do you pray every day now at this point? How is your meditate from that day you took a third step? Like, what does that evolve to what you do maybe now? Like, what do you pray?
Yeah, so like, to be authentically as honest as I can, my relationship with God, prayer, meditation has had some really high peaks and some really difficult valleys. I like my first couple of years in recovery, man, my life was being saved. Every promise that it's in the big book, whether I didn't believe it, like, I was rocketed into the 4th dimension, right, which is the existence of being present, at least from my understanding. And I found that inner self so I've been consistent for years, especially a meditation practice, going out, seek, other avenues, which is the best thing about AA, or I think recovery as well. It's a journey that could lead to so many things. So formal meditations through different groups, centering prayer. I would say that in the last 6 months, I have taken significant efforts to be more consistent with my prayer and readings. Big fan of Course in Miracles, if anybody knows that literature as well. And so my prayer, meditation, and the best thing about meditation, man, is that it's so expansive. You could look at some trees, which is a big thing for me. I'm a big nature guy. I look at trees and sit and contemplate for 3 minutes. If I get that time, that's meditation, and I think prayer is talking to God, prayer is talking to the universe, prayer is petitioning, saying something, it's speaking it into existence. But for me, yeah, so the last 6 months I've been way more consistent. I've learned that thinking about God and praying to God aren't always the same thing for me. So I need a little bit of structured engagement.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. It was difficult for me. I wanted to argue with people about God's philosophy, kind of background, theology, just waiting for someone to walk into that bear trap on me in AA so I could dress them down. And I was missing the entire point. I'm dying of alcoholism.
I'll be honest. My first conception of God was I was in that rehab and I was having serious thoughts of suicide because things were so overwhelming for the first time in my life. And I said that prayer, and it's a really weird moment for me to talk about. Some crazy coincidences happened. It'll be really quick. It happened to be 4 o'clock, so the bells went off because it's 4 o'clock. It happened to stop snowing, so like the clouds parted a little bit. And the most important thing that I felt was that in the way I label is that I felt forgiveness for maybe the first time in my life. And I said to myself, whatever that power was, I will chase it to the end of this world. I think I said whatever that feeling was. Like, it was, and that changed. Like, that was it. You know what I mean? Not that I got struck sober, but I was like, I didn't, you said God, I heard forgiveness. I was like, because whatever that power is, right? The experience of actually feeling forgiven, how transformative that is. I was like, oh, that's my higher power. There it
And
is. And I
was
don't
this
know where it
around
comes from.
step three, like this dance between steps 1 and 3? You got hit with this
Yeah, it was kind
moment?
of like I said, step one was a gift for me. Like I
Yeah,
didn't know how all that resolve and like, no, I'll never be an addict, or like, I don't know how I just got that gift of like really accepting that drugs and alcohol were gonna without a doubt ruin my life. And I think step two and three were kind of like I got exposed to a power that felt again like forgiveness. And I said, whatever that is, I need more of it. Not that I need more of it, but I was like,
yeah, yeah.
I want
You're
that freeing.
you're an addict now for forgiveness.
Yeah, it's crazy, and then what that allowed me to do is I jumped into the treatment program. I threw out the
Sure.
bag of weed that I had. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
I called my
yeah.
friend who was my running partner, and I was
Well,
like,
that's
"Oh,
real.
dude, like," I was like, "I'm in," and he tells me all the time, he's like, "Oh," he goes, "When you called me talking about that, I was like, I knew I had to find new friends because he wasn't ready, like he was still using. So like, I was open, I was willing, and that's what
That's
step three talks about, right? The door of willingness, the key of willingness, and
yeah.
willingness is action. It's not how I feel. It's what I mean. It is a little bit, but the truth of the matter, it's what I end up actually doing.
You
That,
could easily disregard a moment like that. You took it. That was your spiritual experience. Like that's
yeah,
how I hear the story play out. It's an existential moment that, you know, catapulted you into a life of recovery and service.
yeah. The beginning, because I don't want
The
to. I
beginning.
wasn't.
The
I had a
beginning.
long road. Remember, I had a problem walking the
Yeah.
dog and taking out the recyclables.
No, but
Like,
like, how could you have ever foreseen at that moment what you described as, that's the first 3 steps turn around. How could you have foreseen the life you have today? I mean, that's the
wow.
miracle of taking the risk of sobriety, the adventure of sobriety through going through. I'm going to eventually get through the rest of the steps. I'm going to keep inching forward with honesty. I like where this is going. I think this is me. This is who I am. That's the spiritual awakening. I think we got a couple questions for you, Trevor. This is Lisa, Louisiana. I have a question. So many of us have either grown up with an addict or an alcoholic parents or in a sober community. I have 5 of 6 kids. I am 5 of 6 kids that are struggling now. Do you have any suggestions on what I could do to get her into or stop from the following same path?
Yeah,
Want to
I mean,
tackle that, Trevor?
yeah, I will say I didn't. I have a clinical background, and I do a lot of work with families. Kind of that question, because I understand it is that you have there's a concern that one of your children are headed down the wrong path, right, Joe? Is that's what you're getting from
Yeah,
the
I
question?
think I think it sounds like, is there something I could do before that? Like I guess you would have to unpack a few questions. What's the stage of this addiction? Are people being actively harmed? Is she in harm to herself? Is there something I could be more subtle about? I think that could even be worth a phone call to
Yeah,
maybe
I
see
would
what
be happy. Yeah, I'd be happy to hear more about it. But I think I grew up in a sober house, by the way.
yeah,
My I never knew my dad because he was using drugs. My dad's my stepdad. I've always known him sober. So I wasn't around alcohol or drugs at all. I was around meetings,
yeah,
and like the Serenity Prayer was in my house. Like so sometimes, like Joe, you mentioned, right? Like the drugs and alcohol create addiction, and they can create a physical dependence on
yeah,
substances,
sure,
but the spiritual malady or the personality defect or the self-centeredness that's run off so much fear, that that was happening from point of consciousness.
yeah,
There was no hidden door, and that's just my story. I know some people have a different
sure.
experience, but
I
you
can
don't.
relate to that story, and I know others that don't have addictions, but they're very distinct. Something's wrong. Like prior to that, alcohol solved that for me for a while. It was a real
Right.
great medication for. I would never have gotten through high school without LSD, marijuana, alcohol. It was so uncomfortable.
Yeah, I believe that the my the way I responded to substances was not entirely the same that other people around me were we all were using the same thing,
Sure.
using the same amount, but somewhere underneath, alcohol and drugs were becoming a huge, huge solution to a problem I couldn't even identify versus it
Yeah.
just being fun.
It could be a very subtle problem. I mean, but most of the progressive and intelligent and articulate things are really defining it as an insecure detachment disorder, trauma not even being this huge event, attunement, too much cortisol, maybe at the time that you were developing the self-soothing mechanism of releasing your own dopamine to go to sleep when you're a child. So there's a lot of variations that are very complex that could happen to a mind. And then when I meet dopamine from alcohol, it's a different reaction than someone that might have a more developed soothing mechanism. And it doesn't mean this isn't about intelligence. It's about, so this is where this inadequacy was growing in me in childhood. I wasn't able to reconcile it. There was no identity. It was transparent to me and other people. I've always felt this inadequacy. Why don't I measure up? What do I have to do to prove this? Alcohol helped me tremendously with that. Quick question, Brian Young. Joe, what was the guided meditation you introduced? The one we used, we did a little 2 series that was Waking Up, that app. And that was a daily introduction class, Brian. Hi, everyone. So you growing up in AA, like when you returned and got sober, did you know a lot of people? Like, was it still the same area? Like,
Yeah, I mean, I didn't go to my parents' home group, but
yeah,
I was kicked out of my house at 20. So then I moved around the country for 5 years, and so then, when I came back, yeah, I stayed away from my parents' home group, but I had known their friends. They knew me, and they knew what was happening. By the way, like that, and like
yeah,
we talk about selfishness and self-centeredness. I brought drugs and alcohol repeatedly into my sober home, and unfortunately, part of the story is that my mom relapsed on something I brought into the house. Now, I know from a clinician standpoint, from an understanding of my recovery is my responsibility, but I had no perception of my true impact on the people around me. And so you talk about that selfishness and self-centeredness. I love my mom. I'm a mama's boy. I would do anything for her. And I would have told you that in my active addiction. But I repeatedly brought drugs and alcohol into their house,
yeah,
and had no thought of, hey, is this good for them? Yeah, mind you, all the money I would steal, like all the other but like just
yeah,
that concept.
yeah.
And that's that self-centeredness, that's selfishness, and truly, of course I needed drugs and alcohol because I could never satisfy myself, and I was living that shame-based life.
So, did you feel a sense of forgiveness in between steps and 3? Just like now that it's passed, if we could unpack it a little, you got overwhelmed with a sense of forgiveness that life's going to be okay. Maybe it's worth living. Was that prior to taking the inventory? Like right now?
Oh, yeah, no, so it
Yeah,
talks about the third step promises, and so this is still in treatment.
sure.
What I mean? It's like it really went from like, so we talk about the principles, right?
Yeah,
And so right, we talk about powerlessness, but I really see it's like honesty. So the treatment experience, I was honest for the first time in my life about things that I had felt, said, done, experienced for the first time, and that brought over a cascading effect of shame. So much again, where I was really, really, depressed. But it was in that point of desperation that AA and NA were coming into this treatment program, and I had people that were already 2 or 3 months ahead of me in the program, that there was hope, that there was this hope that they had. And so I said this prayer out of desperation of step 2, kind of saying like, I know I'm insane. I can't solve myself. Like, please help me. I don't know what to do. And it's so hard to describe forgiveness because it's not something that other people can give us.
yeah,
I think you think of the amends process, you think of all the times where somebody says, "Oh, I forgive you," but if you don't forgive yourself, it doesn't matter what they say.
yeah,
It's so I had this I'll never forget. I mean, it was, again, I don't like talking about it because it was such a
Yeah.
defining moment, and I know it gets a
Yeah.
little weird because it didn't strike me
Yeah.
sober. But I ran into the place and I said something just happened, and I was crying, and I was like, I don't know what happened. But so we talk about third step, right? Letting go of old ideas. Right in that moment, Joe, I had one of the most important old ideas. So I had a new idea that I will never have to be alone again in my life.
Wow, that's overwhelming.
And so,
That's a good
and
take.
alcohol, yeah,
It's a truth that it could be true. It's not like a delusion. You just coming to terms with a truth that could save you. We don't have to be alone. You could be of
yeah,
service. I could connect with people because how could addiction be anything else but a disconnection? So a total disconnection of emotion. I'm living this private life in my head, regardless of the
right,
shame and the drugs. There's this other version of me. I know like it's dishonest. People don't know who I am. I'm not always myself. I wanted to just read something real quick from NA. John Carr at our facility will love that. Uh, so, but it's right on line to what you were saying of the promises of the third step, and this is just making the decision. You didn't even take the action to it yet. If we are thorough and sincere about taking the third step, we will notice a change for the better. Our fears are lessened. Our
mm,
faith begins to grow as we learn the true meaning of surrender. We are no longer fighting fear, anger, guilt, self-pity, or depression. We realize that the power that brought us to this program is still with us and will continue to guide us if we allow it. We are slowly beginning to lose the paralyzing fear of hopelessness. I mean, that's your experience in the
yeah.
third step.
And you get to re-experience that, by the way. Like, so this third step, like I had a, so it's those experiences are available when it's sincerely taken, not just that first time, right? But 11 years later, if I'm sincere in what this means to me, I leave my little meditation corner not feeling so alone, not feeling so burdened. Like you said, like how do we feel alone surrounded by people? Oh, it's because I'm absorbed with myself. I can't connect with the
Yep.
people that are trying to love me because I have all of this bondage of me. And unfortunately, I can't just snap out of it. I don't have that power, and you talk about personality change. I'll say it. I have always wanted to change the way that I think. I that is one thing I've known. I was like, I have always, and I was never able to do it until I came into the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that was like huge for me. It's like I don't think the same. I still have selfish thoughts, of course, but my narrative has significantly changed for
Yeah.
sure. And that's directly related to this idea of becoming part of a community, agreeing, taking that oath, like you mentioned, making a decision based on action. And I think we all know what it's like to make a decision and feel good about it instinctively. Like
Yeah.
New Year, like, oh, I'm not going to eat McDonald's. Like January 2nd, I was at McDonald's. But January 1st, I was like, yeah, I'm not going to eat McDonald's.
Yeah.
Like I felt good, but I didn't follow through with action. So there's recovery takes work. It does.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. We had a question from Akiva. Akiva, in the line with what you were describing as the underlying issue of addiction, how can one work a program to address the issue before they go all the way down the path of physical dependency? Well, that path ending in fatality, death, it's a fatal disorder. I mean, if we could scale it back, I think that's the fight of why we're all on here tonight and sober before we're dead or mentally ill. And I think you can measure that in the last century, from the advent of Alcoholics Anonymous to neuroscience, psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy from the 50s. And I see every decade getting better and the language getting more intelligent and broader, that people are definitely getting sober a lot sooner. I think there's been some hiccups with the opioid crisis, but we're seeing that. It's the identification of trauma and people not having to lose. I mean, when I first came to AA, I don't know if you relate to this, Trevor. The old timers would be like, that guy's not ready. He still has a car. It's like, holy God, there is a brutality to being all the way at the bottom like that. You had more street cred if you got totally broken. You could get off that train anytime you want because truth will prevail. If you can get to the conscious experience that Trevor spoke so well to tonight, that's leaving the train of addiction. And I think it would have been a lot harder. I don't know. Let's be a hypothetical here. What if your parents weren't living a spiritual program? It could have been another decade of brutality to be introduced to that. I mean, really, there has to be a consideration. Did that help you get sober sooner?
Truthfully,
No.
I don't, I don't believe, sometimes we talk about like, oh, a person needs to be willing to
Mm-hmm.
get help. And like as a clinician for 10 years and doing what I do now, right, working with avenues, is that I was not willing. When I walked through that door, I was going to drink wine and do cocaine on the weekends. That was my bright idea. I didn't want to be really homeless again. So, do I think that their recovery helped me? Yeah, because once I wanted to be sober, I had their support. You know what I mean? Like that was huge. Like the conversations, but and I don't think it made anything worse either. You know what I mean? Like they tried their best. I think if anything, they gave me, I thank them actually a lot. I say, you guys gave me such a loving environment to grow up in, like I think we hear people all the time that come from some really difficult situations.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think their recovery dramatically improved my life experience.
Yeah,
for sure.
I would say it has to. My dad was in sobriety. My brother. These are all hypotheticals, but that eases the destruction that we couldn't measure in the 17th, 18th century. How many people were dying of opioids or alcohol, and the brutality and the stigma that came with that. That had nothing to do with, a cognitive science of what's going on in a mind. Or a child's life, if there's severe abuse, you can see it. And I think it could be treated at any time, or at least even prior to addiction identified, but that's its own discussion someday. But that was a really interesting question. Akiva's always trying to send some zingers
He's a
in
good
there.
man.
Real quick, I want to address Shannon. I am so sorry you're having some technical difficulties. It could be, I don't know if it's an issue on us or anyone else experiencing it. But if you need anything, please reach out to us or your alumni coordinator. Sorry this was your experience. Brian. Joe Kane here always says you should practice steps 1, 2, and 3 in their daily lives. How do you practice the third step in your affairs as you navigate a sober life when faced with challenges? It is through prayer or giving up to the group or a sponsor.
Yeah. So I think the first thing is being able to recognize the option, right? All of a sudden, we went from a way of living of not really seeing an option to now being in recovery where I'm like, do I want to steal that? Do I want to steal that? Let's just say that was a big thing for me. And then I was like, wait, that's not aligned with this sober life that I'm trying to live. That was never a thought before. So now I have a choice, but I can't make that choice on my own power. So like you mentioned before, sometimes, especially in early recovery, I'd call my sponsor, right? I would choose not to make a decision until after I made it to a meeting. I would double down on prayer, right? Serenity prayer and all of its great, it's used so often, but the ability to reset the mind and sit and still. So it's almost like any tool accessible is me practicing my third step, even if it means I'm going to go for a walk, because this is the idea. The other option is only an option because now I have a third step in my life. Like those other options weren't there. They weren't conscious. I didn't have a significant choice, but now the playing field is even. Yeah, I don't want to call my sponsor and rat myself out. That sucks, hurts my ego, right? But I have a choice. I get to choose do I still want to make this decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of God? Nobody said it's going to be easy. And also, the best thing about Alcoholics Anonymous is nobody said we're going to do it perfectly. So yeah, all those things that you mentioned, and then more, right? Literature, reading, talking to friends. I mean, doing anything to come back to what that, and for me, in its simplest form, it's like to do God's will now is can I practice the principles in all my affairs? And I've heard in the AA, if you can't practice the principles in all your affairs, well, then you should change your affairs. And so, those are little gems that I realized, like I took 10 years in, I'm like, this is the right thing I should be doing. And I'm like, I should probably change my affairs, because I want to follow through on that decision, of continuing to turn my will and my life over to that care.
Oh, Trevor, that's a spiritual education, a nickel at a time. They used to always say, you'll get a nickel at a time here. Change your affairs. We're winding down. We're at the hour. And it's been great. Trevor, I hope you come back again. We're going to do this a couple times a year, and I hope to see you at Lake Ariel soon. I want to thank you.
Thank you.
Such a genuine and sincere message. It's so refreshing to hear someone. That was the first time I felt like I get to know you. We just shared at a meeting. So anyone who needs help with anything, please always reach out to Avenues and your alumni coordinator. If you can, check out, and you're interested, check out Hammock Readings on Facebook and YouTube. It's a nice way to meditate, reset. They're all kind of evergreen videos, seasonal, with poems, a daily intention, a prayer. And if everyone that was here tonight, Rachel wanted to do, Brendan wanted to, Brooke Abner wanted to do a raffle. So please, we want to get some hoodies out there. We really appreciate the support, guys. And remember, your community helping each other. Alumni helping alumni, and anything you need from us, will always be here to support you. Trevor, thanks again for coming out tonight.
Thank you, Joe. It was a pleasure. It really was. I look forward to attending more.
Sounds good, man. Good night. Good night, everyone. Be safe.
Bye, guys.